The grand atrium of Oasis 9 was a cathedral of glass and cold ambition, stretching so high that the artificial clouds gathered near the ceiling. For 4 hours, Silas Vane had been practicing the art of dying while standing up. His back ached. His feet felt like they were being crushed by the gravity plates of the station, and the air tasted like recycled lavender and stagnant bureaucracy. He was wedged between a three-eyed merchant from the Xylos Syndicate, who smelled faintly of ozone, and Ambassador Jax, a cybernetic entity whose internal cooling fans hummed with a rhythmic, irritating buzz. The assembly was a sea of impossible biology. There were creatures with translucent skin revealing pulsating internal organs, entities composed of sentient gas contained in pressurized suits, and the high lords of the core systems draped in fabrics woven from solar filaments. All of them were here to discuss trade routes and mineral rights, the mundane pulse of a galaxy that had long ago forgotten the wonder of the stars in favor of the profit they provided. Silas, wearing a flight jacket that had seen better decades and boots scuffed by the dust of a dozen backwater moons, felt like a grease stain on a silk sheet. He was a freighter pilot, a man who hauled heavy isotopes through the silent voids. He had no business here, yet here he was, representing the scrap heap interests of the Outer Rim territories, because everyone else was too busy or too drunk to attend. "Stand up straight, Vane," Jax hissed through a mechanical vocoder. "You are representing the Terran Protectorate. I am representing a bunch of people who want cheaper fuel and more reliable oxygen scrubbers," Silas muttered back, his voice gravelly from years of breathing ship air. "I think leaning against this pillar conveys exactly the right level of desperate exhaustion." Then the heavy doors at the far end of the atrium ground open. The sound was not mechanical. It was a low, guttural vibration that resonated in the marrow of Silas's bones. The chatter of 10,000 delegates died instantly. Matriarch Zilia of the Obsidian Throne entered the chamber. She did not walk so much as displace the space around her. Her skin was the color of a bruised nebula, and her robes were crafted from liquid shadow that seemed to swallow the ambient light. Behind her, floating on a grav platform, was a projection of the princess. Princess Kalith. The image flickered. It was not a technical glitch. The very air around the hologram seemed to warp and fold, as if the light particles were struggling to maintain a coherent shape. She was hauntingly beautiful in a way that defied human optics. Her hair was a cascading river of starlight, and her eyes were twin voids that suggested a terrifying depth. But it was the distortion that caught Silas's attention. The floor beneath the hologram seemed to ripple like water. The shadows of nearby guards stretched and twisted into impossible geometries. "Honored representatives," the matriarch began, her voice a harmonic resonance that filled every corner of the vast space. "For 17 solar cycles, my daughter has lived in the silence of the void chamber. The gift she carries, the internal singularity, is a power that predates your empires and your laws. It is the breath of the universe's birth, and it is a heavy burden for one heart to hold." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd like a searchlight. "The time has come for a covenant. My daughter requires a consort, not a king, not a warrior, but a soul capable of standing within her storm without being unmade. We have opened our doors to the galaxy. We have welcomed your scholars, your psychics, and your heroes." A murmur of unease rippled through the delegates. Silas heard the whispers. The last suitor, a high paladin of the Sunreach, had his mind shattered into 3 distinct temporal personalities within 10 minutes of contact. Another, a genius-level telepath, had simply ceased to exist, his physical form collapsing into a cloud of subatomic particles. "Is there no one left?" the matriarch challenged, her voice rising with a desperate edge. "Is there no one in this vast, crowded galaxy brave enough to marry my daughter?" Silence crashed down. It was a physical weight. Proud generals suddenly found the patterns on the floor fascinating. Wealthy merchants adjusted their robes and looked at their chronometers. Fear was the only universal language in the room. Silas looked at the hologram of Kalith. He didn't see a monster or a weapon. He saw the way her hands were clenched in her lap. He saw the profound, crushing loneliness in those void black eyes. It was a look he knew well. It was the look he saw in his own reflection every time he stared into the blackness of a jump gate. wondering if anyone would notice if he just kept flying into the dark. His life was a series of empty rooms and rattling engine parts. He had no family, no home, and a debt to the syndicate that would take 3 lifetimes to pay off. He was 38 years old and he was already a ghost. Why not, he thought. He stood up. The movement was small, but in that vacuum of terror, it was like an explosion. Ambassador Jax grabbed his sleeve, his metallic fingers digging into Silas's arm. "Sit down, you fool," Jax hissed. "You'll cause an interstellar incident." Silas shook him off. He stepped out from the modest Terran section and began the long walk toward the central dais. His boots clanked on the polished obsidian floor, the sound echoing through the hushed atrium. He felt thousands of eyes on him, pitying, mocking, shocked. He reached the base of the platform and looked up at the matriarch. She was towering, a goddess of gravity and ancient sorrow. "I'll do it," Silas said. His voice was steady, lacking the flowery oratory of the diplomats. "I'm Silas Vane. I've spent 20 years navigating the fold. My brain is already half fried from jump space. I don't think your daughter can do much worse than a collapsing wormhole." The matriarch stared at him. For a moment, the air tension in the room spiked. Then she leaned forward, her luminous eyes narrowing. "You are a human," she said, as if the word itself was a curiosity. "A species of short lives and fragile minds. Do you understand that you are volunteering for a fate that has broken the greatest intellects of the core?" "I understand that she's been sitting in a room alone for 17 years, Silas replied, gesturing toward the flickering hologram. "And I understand that everyone in this room is terrified of her. I'm not a great intellect, Your Majesty. I'm just a guy who's tired of being alone. If I break, I break. But I'd rather go out doing something that matters than die in a freighter cockpit waiting for a docking permit." The matriarch looked from Silas to the image of her daughter. A flicker of something that might have been hope, or perhaps just profound pity, crossed her face. "The covenant begins tomorrow," she announced, her voice booming. "Let the record show that a son of Earth has stepped into the shadow." As Silas turned to leave, the hologram of Caliph seemed to shift. For a fraction of a second, her eyes locked onto his. The reality around him buckled. He felt a sudden, sharp taste of copper in his mouth and saw a flash of 1,000 stars dying at once. It lasted only a heartbeat, but as he walked away, he knew one thing for certain. His life was over. And for the first time in years, he felt truly awake. The medical wing of the Etherian embassy did not look like any hospital Silas had ever seen. There were no white walls or sterile smells. Instead, the walls were made of a living, pulsing mineral that glowed with a soft, bioluminescent amber. He was strapped to a table that felt less like metal and more like a warm, solidified liquid. A dozen drones, shaped like silver dragonflies, hummed around his head. They were emitting thin beams of violet light that scanned his skull with surgical precision. "Neural density is atypical," a voice said. Silas shifted his gaze. A tall, slender Etherian female with skin the color of lavender stood over a console of floating light panes. Her name was Dr. Alara, and she looked at him with the clinical detachment one might afford a particularly interesting species of insect. "Atypical?" Silas asked. "Is that doctor speak for I'm stupid?" "On the contrary," Alara replied, her fingers dancing through the light panes. "Your synaptic pathways show significant scarring. It appears you have spent an excessive amount of time in non-Euclidean space without proper shielding. Most humans would have suffered a complete cognitive collapse. Your brain, however, has developed a crude form of temporal elasticity. You don't process reality as a linear sequence. You process it as a series of suggestions. I call it the jump space jitters," Silas muttered. "When you spend 10 years hauling cargo through the fold, you stop caring if the walls are melting as long as the engine is still humming." "It is likely the only reason you are still breathing," she said, turning a holographic display toward him. "This is the baseline reading of Princess Calith's presence." Silas looked. The graph was a chaotic mess of jagged lines and sudden voids. It looked like the heartbeat of a hurricane. "The internal singularity she carries doesn't just emit energy," Alara explained. "It negotiates with the laws of physics. It asks the universe to stop being certain." Within 5 meters of her, Time can flow backward. Within 2 meters, matter can lose its molecular cohesion. The previous suitors attempted to fight this. They used mental anchors, psychic shields, or technological dampeners. They all failed because they tried to remain rigid. And you think I'm flexible? I think you are already broken in just the right way, she said, and for the first time Silas saw a trace of genuine concern in her eyes. But understand this, Captain Vane. Flexibility has its limits. If you bend too far, there is no coming back. You will not die. You will simply become a permanent part of the distortion, a ghost caught in a moment that never ends. Sounds like my last relationship, Silas joked, though his stomach did a slow roll. After the scans came the orientation. He was handed a small silver disc that hummed against his palm. A cortex anchor, Ilara said. It won't stop the distortion, but it will give your ego a focal point. If you start to forget who you are, or when you are, focus on the vibration of the disc. It is tuned to the frequency of Earth's magnetic field. It is a tether to your home. Silas pocketed the disc. I haven't been home in 20 years, Doctor, but I'll take the tether anyway. The walk to the isolation wing was a journey into a different kind of darkness. As Silas followed the royal guards, silent, armored giants whose footsteps made no sound, the station around them began to change. The architecture grew more organic, more alien. The air became thick with the scent of ozone and something that reminded him of a forest after a heavy rain, earthy, primal, and ancient. They stopped at a massive door made of a dull, heavy metal that seemed to vibrate. There were no handles, no keypads. This is as far as we go, one of the guards said, his voice muffled by a helmet that looked like a jagged piece of obsidian. Is there a manual? Silas asked, trying to keep his voice light. Tips on what to say? Does she like flowers, or are they a temporal hazard? The guard didn't laugh. Just remember, human, she didn't ask for this power, but she is the power. Don't fight the tide. The doors slid open with a sound like a long, slow exhale. Silas stepped through. The sensation was immediate. It was like stepping off a cliff into a pool of ice water. The door behind him vanished. Not closed, but simply ceased to be part of his immediate reality. The corridor ahead was 1,000 meters long and simultaneously only a single step wide. The walls flickered between solid stone and open space, showing him glimpses of distant galaxies and the inner workings of a clock. He felt a sudden surge of nausea. His vision doubled. He saw his own hands, but they were the hands of a child, then the withered hands of an old man, then back to his scarred, calloused palms. The anchor, he whispered, clutching the silver disc in his pocket. The steady, rhythmic vibration of the disc acted like a heartbeat. He focused on it, pushing through the sensory static. He walked forward, his boots finding purchase on a floor that felt like it was made of shifting sand. Then he saw her. Caliph was standing at the far end of the chamber, silhouetted against a massive viewport that looked out into the heart of a swirling nebula. The reality around her was a violent storm of light and shadow. Fragments of the room, chairs, pedestals, books, floated in the air, drifting in slow, impossible circles. She turned. Her face was even more striking in person. The midnight skin, the starlight hair, and those eyes. They weren't just black. They were a window into the beginning of time. You shouldn't have come, she said. Her voice didn't come from her mouth. It resonated directly inside his mind, accompanied by a flash of memory. The smell of a burnt-out engine, the cold taste of emergency rations, the sound of his mother's voice. The distortion was pulling his thoughts out of his head and weaving them into the air. I get that a lot, Silas said, planting his feet. He had to speak loudly to hear himself over the roar of the silence. But I've never been very good at following directions. She took a step toward him, and the room buckled. Silas felt his knees weaken as a wave of pure, unadulterated existential dread washed over him. It was the feeling of being small, infinitely small, in a universe that was too big to care. It was the feeling that had haunted him his entire life, magnified 1,000 times. Most people scream now, Caliph said, her expression a mask of cold, defensive sorrow. Most people realize that I am a black hole wearing a crown. They see their own insignificance in my eyes and they run. Why aren't you running, Silas Vane? Because I've been insignificant for a long time, Silas replied, fighting to keep his breathing even. You're not showing me anything I haven't seen in the mirror every morning. He took a step forward. The air between them sparked with purple lightning. He felt his memories of the previous hour start to fray, turning into smoke. He focused on the disc in his pocket. Silas Vane, freighter pilot, Oasis 9, Earth. I came here because I saw you in that assembly, he said, his voice straining, and I saw someone who was tired of being treated like a natural disaster. I'm just a guy with a shitty ship and a lot of debts. But I'm here, and I'm staying. Kayla's eyes widened. The storm of objects floating around her slowed. The violet lightning faded. For a moment, the reality in the room stabilized, the walls becoming solid and the floor becoming still. You are stubborn, she whispered, her voice now coming from her lips. It was a soft musical sound. It's my best and worst quality, Silas said, managing a crooked smile. She looked at him for a long time, searching his face with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Then slowly, she extended her hand. It was a beautiful, terrifying gesture. Her fingers were long and elegant, but as they moved through the air, they left trails of light that lingered like ghost fire. If you touch me, Silas Vane, your soul will be laid bare. There are no secrets in the singularity. There is only the truth. Are you prepared for that? Silas looked at her hand. He thought about his empty life, the cold voids of space, and the long years of silence. Then he thought about the warmth in her voice when she spoke his name. He reached out and took her hand. The universe didn't just break, it exploded. Silas felt himself being torn into a billion pieces and scattered across the history of the galaxy. He saw the birth of stars and the death of civilizations. He felt Calith's pain, 17 years of a loneliness so deep it had its own gravity. He felt her fear, her longing, and her hidden, flickering hope. And through the chaos, through the screaming light of 1,000 suns, he held on. He didn't fight the storm. He let it wash through him, like he was a ghost in his own life. When the world finally settled, they were still standing in the chamber. Silas was gasping for air, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was covered in sweat, and his vision was blurred. But he was still there. He was still Silas, and he was still holding her hand. Calith was staring at him, tears of liquid silver tracking down her dark cheeks. You didn't break, she breathed. I told you, Silas wheezed, trying to find his balance. I'm really stubborn. She didn't let go of his hand. In fact, she squeezed it, her skin feeling like cool velvet against his. For the first time in 17 years, the princess of the obsidian throne wasn't alone. And for the first time in his life, Silas Vane knew exactly where he was supposed to be. The silence that followed the moment Silas took Calith's hand was not a lack of sound, but a presence of something heavy and ancient. It felt as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for the human to disintegrate into a cloud of stray atoms and bad memories. When Silas didn't pop like an overinflated suit in a vacuum, the atmosphere in the void chamber shifted from hostile to bewildered. Calith pulled her hand back slowly. The trail of starlight clinging to her fingers didn't vanish. It drifted away like smoke in a zero-gravity environment. She looked at Silas, her eyes scanning him for the fractures she was certain must be there. Behind her, the massive viewports of Oasis 9 showed the rotating arm of the station, but the stars beyond were stretching into long, thin lines of white light, a clear sign that the spatial distortion was still localized around her heart. You are still solid, she whispered. Her voice had lost the mental boom and returned to a soft, melodic timbre that felt like velvet against the harshness of Silas's internal monologue. How can you be solid? I have a very thick skull, princess, Silas said. He leaned back against a floating pedestal that looked like it was made of solidified mercury. It gave way slightly under his weight before firming up. My old captain used to say you could drop a cargo crate on my head, and the crate would be the thing that needed repairs. He was lying, of course. His nerves were screaming. Every inch of his skin felt like it had been scrubbed with industrial sandpaper, and there was a high-pitched ringing in his ears that sounded like a failing reactor core. But he stood his ground. He didn't want her to see the tremors in his hands, so he shoved them deep into the pockets of his flight jacket, gripping the silver disc of the cortex anchor until the edges bit into his palms. The door to the chamber didn't slide open so much as it faded back into the reality of the corridor. Matriarch Xylia entered first, her robes of liquid shadow rippling with an intensity that suggested she was either impressed or deeply concerned. Behind her, Ambassador Jax rolled in on his tracked chassis, his sensors whirring like a swarm of angry hornets. Impossible, Jax's vocoder buzzed. The military slang he usually avoided slipped out in his agitation. This is a total foobar situation for the psychological projections. The human's neural readings should be flatline. He's a total washout on paper, yet he's standing there like he's waiting for a bus. It's not a bus, Jax, Silas said, glancing at the cybernetic envoy. It's a courtship. Try to keep up with the protocol. Matriarch Xylia ignored the ambassador. She walked until she was exactly 3 meters from the pair, the limit of what her own royal shielding could handle. She looked at Silas with a gaze that felt like a surgical probe. You have survived the first contact, Captain Vane, the matriarch said. But the Covenant is not a single moment of bravery. It is a sustained endurance. The internal singularity does not rest. It will gnaw at your mind while you sleep. It will twist your dreams until you cannot tell the difference between your childhood and the heat death of the universe. I've had worse roommates, Silas replied. He felt a sudden, sharp spike of heat in his chest. For a split second, he wasn't in the embassy. He was back on his old ship, the Star Kicker, watching the fuel gauges drop to 0 while a pirate corvette locked its targeting sensors on his hull. He felt the cold terror of that moment, the smell of burnt plastic and ozone, the crushing weight of knowing he was about to die alone in the dark. Then Caleth stepped closer. The memory vanished. The fear remained, but it was anchored by the reality of her presence. The matriarch turned to her daughter. Caleth, what do you feel? The princess didn't look at her mother. She kept her eyes on Silas. He feels quiet, she said, like the space between stars. The others were always loud. Their thoughts were like static, screaming to be heard, screaming to be safe. He just accepts the noise. Silas shifted his weight, feeling a bit like a specimen in a jar. Listen, I don't mean to cut the mystery short, but if I'm going to be the official human punching bag for this singularity of yours, I'm going to need some decent coffee and a place to sit that doesn't try to eat my boots. A trace of a smile touched Caleth's lips. It was the first human expression he had seen on her, and it made the cosmic terror of her eyes feel a little less overwhelming. The matriarch gestured to the guards. Escort Captain Vane to the sovereign suite. He is no longer a guest. He is the consort elect. Prepare the ritual of the first meal for tomorrow. We shall see if he can handle the physical manifestation of the gift. As Silas walked out, flanked by the obsidian armored giants, he caught Jax watching him. The ambassador's red optical sensor was pulsing rapidly, a sign that he was transmitting a high-bandwidth report back to the Terran Protectorate. You're playing a dangerous game, Vane, Jax hissed as they passed each other in the corridor. You're a bottom-tier pilot. You don't have the clearance for this kind of high-stakes play. The Syndicate is already asking questions about your debts. Tell the Syndicate they can send their bills to the Obsidian Throne, Silas said, not slowing his pace. I'm moving up in the world, Jax. I'm a professional distraction now. The Sovereign Suite was a sprawling expanse of rooms that defied the standard layout of Oasis 9. The walls were semi-transparent, showing the glittering traffic of the station's hub, but the floor was made of a soft, moss-like substance that smelled of damp earth. It was a strange blend of high technology and primal nature. Silas didn't explore the rooms. He went straight to the large circular bed and collapsed onto it. The moment he let go of his composure, the shaking started. His entire body erupted in a violent tremor. The cortex anchor fell from his pocket and clattered onto the floor. He curled into a ball, his teeth chattering. The contact with Caleth hadn't just been a physical touch. It had been an invasion. Fragments of her life were lodged in his brain like shrapnel. He saw a young girl sitting in a room where the walls were constantly melting. He felt the weight of a crown that didn't just sit on her head but pressed into her soul. He felt the sheer, agonizing boredom of 17 years spent watching the universe through a filtered lens. You're a fool, Silas, he whispered to the empty room. You're going to get yourself unmade. He reached out and grabbed the silver disc, squeezing it until his knuckles turned white. He thought about the alternatives. He could go back to the Star Kicker. He could spend the next 20 years hauling industrial waste for pennies, dodging the debt collectors, and dying in a cheap bunk on some mining colony where the air was mostly sulfur. Or he could stay here. He could be the one person who didn't run away from the girl with the dying stars in her eyes. Courage isn't about not being afraid, Silas, his father had told him a lifetime ago, back when the sky was still blue and the ground was made of dirt. It's about being so scared you can't breathe and then taking the next step anyway. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a paladin or a scholar. He was just a guy who knew what it was like to be the ghost in the room. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but the space behind his eyelids was filled with the purple glow of a nebula, and the sound of Calith's voice echoed in the chambers of his heart. The ritual of the first meal was less of a dinner and more of a high-stakes physics experiment. Silas sat at a long, floating table made of a translucent material that looked like frozen smoke. Opposite him sat Calith. She was dressed in a gown of white light that seemed to pulse in sync with her heartbeat. The room was filled with observers, Matriarch Zilia, Ambassador Jax, and a dozen Etherean priests whose faces were hidden behind masks of polished gold. The food was served by drones that kept a respectful distance of 10 meters. The plates were lowered onto the table via tractor beams. "This looks fancy," Silas said, staring at a piece of fruit that appeared to be changing colors every 3 seconds. "What's the catch? Does the salad try to fight back?" "It is the resonance," Calith explained. She reached for a glass of liquid that looked like liquid silver. "The closer I am to physical matter, the more the singularity tries to incorporate it into its own frequency. To eat with me is to share in the instability." Silas picked up a fork. It felt solid for a moment, then became as soft as rubber, then turned into a cold, hard metal again. He gripped it tightly. "Just like my grandma's cooking," he said. "You never knew if the meat was done or if it was still trying to graze." He took a bite of something that tasted like honey and copper. Immediately, the room shifted. The ceiling vanished, replaced by a view of the galactic core. He felt the table beneath him turn into a rushing river of time. He saw a dozen versions of Calith sitting across from him. One was a child, one was an old woman, one was a warrior covered in blood, and one was exactly as she sat now. The priest began to chant, a low guttural sound that seemed to anchor the reality in the room. "Steady, Vane," he told himself. "Don't let the slick shifters in the back see you sweat." He focused on the Calith in front of him. He looked past the shimmering light and the temporal echoes. He looked at the way she was holding her glass, her fingers trembling just a tiny bit. She was terrified, too. She was terrified that she would accidentally blink him out of existence. "You're doing great," Silas said, his voice sounding like it was coming from a long distance. Calith looked up, surprised. "You are experiencing the fragmentation. I can see it in your eyes. Your pupils are dilating at different rates. One of your memories is currently leaking into the ambient air." Silas looked to his left and saw a faint, ghostly image of himself at age 10, crying over a broken toy. "Yeah, well, that toy was a vintage Star Cruiser model." "It was a tragedy," he said, forcing a grin. "But forget the kid. He's fine. Let's talk about the music." Calith paused, her glass halfway to her lips. "Music? There is no music here. Only the ritual chant." "No," Silas said, leaning forward. The table groaned as the distortion intensified. "Under the chanting, under the noise of your singularity, there's a rhythm. It's faint, but it's there. It sounds like a heartbeat. No, like a signal, a long-range transmission." The matriarch stood up, her robes darkening to a deep, ominous violet. "What are you talking about, human?" Silas didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Calith. He reached out his hand across the table. The air between them hummed with a violent energy. Sparks of purple light danced across his skin, smelling of burnt air. "Stop!" Jax yelled from the sidelines. "The power levels are off the charts. You're going to cause a core breach in the station's dampeners." Silas ignored him. He pushed his hand through the resistance. It felt like pushing through a wall of thick, electrified gelatin. His fingers burned. His vision began to gray out at the edges. "Calith," he said, his voice straining. "Listen to it. Don't fight the power. Don't try to contain it. Just listen. Kaleth looked at him with a mix of fear and desperation. I can't. If I let go, the room will be destroyed. I have spent my whole life holding the walls up. The walls are what's making the noise, Silas said. Trust me. I've navigated blind through 3 collapsing nebulas. The noise is never the problem. It's the things the noise is trying to hide. Kaleth reached out her own hand. When their fingertips touched, the ritual chant stopped. The priest fell silent. The lights in the embassy flickered and died. For a moment, there was total darkness. Then a sound erupted. It wasn't a voice, and it wasn't music. It was a massive, booming pulse of information. It was a signal, ancient, powerful, and unmistakably intentional. Silas saw it then. The internal singularity wasn't a curse. It wasn't a random mutation or a cosmic accident. It was a bridge, a doorway. Kaleth's power wasn't a weapon. It was a beacon. She was a radio tower built into a living soul, and she had been screaming into the void for 17 years, waiting for someone to tune into the right frequency. The vision was so intense that Silas felt his mind being pulled out of his body. He saw a distant part of the galaxy, a sector that had been marked as the dead zone for millennia. He saw a massive structure, a machine the size of a solar system, dormant and waiting. Then the connection snapped. Silas was thrown backward, his chair flipping as he hit the floor. The lights came back on, humming with a frantic, unstable energy. The drones were buzzing in circles, their sensors blinded. Kaleth sat perfectly still, her eyes wide, her starlight hair glowing with an intensity that illuminated the entire hall. "Did you hear it?" she whispered. "I heard it," Silas said, coughing, as he pushed himself up from the floor. He wiped a trickle of blood from his nose. "It's not a gift, Kaleth. It's an invitation." The matriarch was at the table in an instant, her face a mask of cold fury and hidden terror. "What did you do, human? What did you see?" Silas stood up, his legs shaking but his gaze firm. He looked at Jax, who was frantically recording everything. He looked at the priests. Then he looked at Kaleth. "I saw where she comes from," Silas said, "and I saw who's been waiting for her to wake up." The room erupted into chaos. The Etherian priests began to argue in their harmonic language, while Jax started shouting about protocol violations and the threat to galactic security. But in the middle of the noise, Silas and Kaleth just looked at each other. The fear was still there, but it was different now. It was the fear of the unknown, not the fear of the self. Kaleth stood up and walked around the table. She didn't wait for the tractor beams or the drones. She walked straight to Silas and helped him up. This time, when she touched him, the reality didn't warp. It felt solid. It felt real. "You are the first person who didn't try to fix me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You just listened." "I'm a pilot, Kaleth," Silas said, squeezing her hand. "My job is to find the way through the storm, not to stop the wind from blowing." As they were led out of the hall, Silas knew that the game had changed. The core systems wouldn't just be afraid of Kaleth anymore. They would want her. They would want the signal. They would want the bridge. And he was the only one standing between a girl and a galaxy that wanted to turn her into a key. Jax caught up with him in the hallway, his tracks clicking rapidly on the tiles. "Vane, you've really done it now. That signal, the Protectorate has been looking for that frequency for 300 years. They're going to want to extract every bit of data from your head." "Let them try," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. "I've got a lot of junk in my head, Jax. They'll have to dig through 10 years of bad poetry and technical manuals before they find anything useful." "You won't make it to the end of the Covenant," the ambassador warned. "The core will move against you. They won't let a greased monkey from the rim hold the coordinates to the first machine." "Then I guess I'll have to get a better wrench," Silas said. He walked away, leaving the cybernetic envoy in the shadows. He had a million questions and a headache that could crack a planet. But as he reached the doors to the Sovereign Suite, he realized something. He wasn't thinking about his debts anymore. He wasn't thinking about the star kicker or the empty bunk waiting for him on the mining colony. He was thinking about the girl who carried a star in her chest. And for the first time in his life, Silas Vane wasn't just surviving. He was fighting for something. He opened the door and found Kaleth waiting for him near the viewport. The distortion was still there, a soft purple haze around her, But it didn't feel like a threat anymore. It felt like a conversation he was only just beginning to understand. "We have a problem, don't we?" she asked, her back to him, as she watched the station's lights. "Yeah," Silas said, leaning against the doorframe. "A big one. The kind that involves a lot of powerful people wanting things they shouldn't have." "Are you afraid?" "Terrified," Silas admitted. "My hands haven't stopped shaking since I stepped onto this station." He walked over to her, standing just close enough to feel the static of her presence. "But I'm not leaving," he added. "I told you I'm stubborn, and I've always wanted to see what's on the other side of a mystery." Caleth turned to him, the starlight in her hair reflecting in his tired eyes. "Then we shall face the mystery together, Captain." Outside, the stars of Oasis 9 continued their slow, indifferent dance, unaware that the signal had been found and that a broken pilot and a lonely princess were about to turn the galaxy upside down. Silas sat by the viewport long after Caleth had retired to the inner chambers. He pulled the silver disc of the Cortex anchor from his pocket and looked at it. It was just a piece of metal, a vibrating tether to a world he barely remembered. He thought about the first machine Jax had mentioned. The legends of the progenitors were common in the Rim, stories of a race that had built the stars and left the keys behind for their children. If Caleth was the key, then the entire galaxy was about to become a very violent place. He looked at his hands. They were still trembling, but the fear didn't feel like a weight anymore. It felt like fuel. It was the same rush he got when he pushed the engines past their limit to outrun a solar flare. "You're a dust kicker, Vane," he told himself. "A void walker. Don't let these high-born slick shifters tell you who you are." He thought about the theme of the day. The Etherean priests had preached about the sacred burden of the gift, but Silas saw it differently. It wasn't a burden if you had someone to help you carry it. It was just baggage. And he was an expert at hauling baggage. He looked out at the station's ring. Thousands of lives were moving through those corridors, each one chasing their own small dreams of profit or power. None of them knew that the rules of the universe were about to change. He stood up, tucked the disc back into his pocket, and walked toward the inner suite. The path ahead was filled with shadows, and the odds were stacked so high he couldn't even see the top. But for the first time in his 38 years, Silas Vane knew he wasn't going to die alone. He had a princess to protect, a signal to follow, and a galaxy to prove wrong. And if that wasn't worth a bit of existential terror, he didn't know what was. The next morning, the news of the signal event would ripple through the station like a shockwave. Embassies would go on lockdown, fleet movements would be detected in the neutral zones, and the price of information would skyrocket. But in the quiet of the Sovereign Suite, Silas Vane just made himself a cup of coffee and waited for the next impossible thing to happen. The morning came with a knock on the door that sounded less like a visitor and more like an executioner. It was a sharp, rhythmic pounding that Silas recognized as the signature of the Etherean Honor Guard. He opened the door to find two of the obsidian-armored giants and a very stressed-looking Jax. "The matriarch has convened the High Council," Jax said, his vocal processor clipping with static. "They want to discuss the nature of the transmission, and they want to discuss your continued involvement." "I'm the consort-elect," Silas said, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "My involvement is part of the contract." "The contract is for a husband, not a revolutionary," Jax snapped. "You've unlocked something that was supposed to stay buried for another 10,000 years. The core systems are demanding you be turned over for questioning." Silas looked over his shoulder at Caleth, who had emerged from her room. She looked tired, the light in her eyes a bit dimmer than the day before. "What do you want to do?" Silas asked her. Caleth looked at the guards, then at Jax. "I want to know what the signal said. My whole life has been a puzzle with no picture on the box." Silas gave me the picture. "I am not going back to the silence." Silas turned back to the ambassador. "You heard the lady? We're going to the council, but we're going on our terms." "You don't have terms, Vane. You're a human in a jacket that smells like engine oil." "Then I'll be the best-smelling human in the room," Silas said, stepping out into the hallway. "Let's go." As they walked toward the council chamber, Silas felt the eyes of the station on them. The whispers were louder now, a buzzing swarm of speculation. He felt the fear rising in his chest again, cold and sharp. He looked at Caleth. She was walking with her head held high, the starlight hair flowing behind her like a banner. He realized then that he wasn't just her protector. She was his too. Her courage gave him the strength to face the politicians, and his stubbornness gave her the strength to face the void. It was a fair trade. The council chamber was a massive arena of light and noise. Representatives from 100 worlds were shouting, their voices a cacophony of languages and frequencies. Silas walked to the center of the arena, holding Calith's hand. The reality around them began to ripple, a soft purple distortion that pushed back against the noise. The room fell silent. Silas looked up at the matriarch who sat on the highest throne. He looked at the delegates who wanted to tear them apart to find the secrets of the universe. He took a deep breath. "All right, you bunch of junk bucket politicians," Silas said, his voice echoing through the silence. "You want to know about the signal? Then sit down and listen, because we're only going to say this once." The story was no longer about a human marrying a princess. It was about the galaxy finally waking up, and Silas Vane was going to be the one to tell it. The council chamber of the core systems was not a place built for truth. It was a theater designed to manufacture consent. It was a massive, tiered amphitheater where the lighting was strategically dimmed to make the delegates look like looming shadows of divine judgment. At the center of the arena stood Silas and Calith, two small points of light against a tide of cold, calculating intellect. Silence had fallen after Silas's outburst, a thick, suffocating quiet that felt like the moments before a hull breach. Silas could feel the sweat itching behind his neck, his heart doing a frantic percussion against his ribs. He gripped the silver disc in his pocket, the rhythmic vibration of the cortex anchor, the only thing keeping his reality from folding into 1,000 paper cranes of madness. "Captain Vane," Matriarch Zelia began, her voice echoing from the high seat like the tolling of a funeral bell. "You speak of signals and invitations as if you understand the fundamental architecture of the first machine. You are a freighter pilot. Your species has barely mastered the art of not killing itself with its own primitive fission reactors. To suggest that you have parsed a transmission that our greatest minds have failed to detect for 3 centuries is not just arrogant, it is a hot mic levels of delusion." Silas didn't blink. He felt the purple haze of Calith's presence swirling around him, a soft static that tasted like ozone and forgotten birthdays. He looked up at the matriarch, then at the delegates of the Vin Collective in the Xylos Syndicate. "Look, you high-born slick shifters can call it whatever you want," Silas said, his voice raspy but projected. "I've spent 20 years listening to the hum of engines and the groan of jump gates. You learn to hear the difference between background radiation and something that has a pulse. That signal wasn't noise. It was a ping, a handshake, and Calith is the only one with the credentials to answer it. The Vin representative, a creature whose body was a cluster of iridescent crystals held together by a containment field, hummed at a frequency that translated into a sharp, mocking tone. If this is true, then the princess is no longer a diplomatic ward. She is a strategic asset of the highest order. The covenant is obsolete. She must be moved to the Prime Research Facility on Velonis Prime immediately for deep core extraction of the frequency." Silas felt Calith's hand tighten in his. The reality around them buckled. A nearby viewing screen shattered, the glass falling in slow motion like a frozen waterfall. "Extraction?" Calith's voice was low, but it vibrated in the floorboards. "You speak of me as if I am a mineral vein to be stripped. I am the heir to the obsidian throne." "You are a danger, Calith," the matriarch said, her voice softening but losing none of its steel. "And if what the human says is true, you are the key to a power that could reshape the entire galaxy. We cannot allow that power to be handled by a grease monkey with a debt problem and a dying ship." Silas looked around the room. He saw the way the guards were shifting their weight, their hands moving toward their pulse rifles. He saw Jax, the cybernetic envoy, hovering near the exit, his optical sensors flickering with a series of red-coded transmissions. The trap was closing. They weren't interested in the covenant. They were interested in the hardware. He felt the old familiar coldness of fear. It was the same fear that had kept him running freight through the pirate-infested zones for a decade. The fear of being trapped, of being used, of being small. But underneath that fear, there was a new sensation. It was a stubborn, jagged heat. He realized then that the council wasn't afraid of the singularity. They were afraid of the girl. Because a girl can say no. A girl can choose her own path. A weapon, however, is a much more comfortable thing to manage. I'm not a hero, Silas thought. I'm just a guy who knows when the air in the room has gone sour. He leaned in toward Calith, his lips brushing the starlight of her hair. Get ready to bug out, he whispered, so low it wouldn't catch on the room's microphones. What? She whispered back, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and dawning realization. On my signal, Silas said. He turned back to the council, spreading his arms wide. You want to talk about assets? Fine. Let's talk about the Star Kicker. She's currently docked in Bay 42. She's got a Class 4 warp drive that I've redlined more times than I can count. She's not much to look at, but she's mine. And as of 5 minutes ago, she's the only ship in this station that's cleared for the consort-elect. The Vin representative hummed again. You are not going to your ship, Captain Vane. You are going to a holding cell for debriefing. Guards. The obsidian armored giants moved. They didn't run. They glided across the floor with the terrifying efficiency of machines. Now, Silas yelled. Calith didn't hesitate. She let go of the control she had maintained for 17 years. She didn't lash out. She simply stopped fighting the singularity. The explosion wasn't one of fire or debris. It was an explosion of possibility. For a heartbeat, the council chamber existed in 3 different centuries simultaneously. The delegates saw the room as it was 100 years ago, as it was now, and as a pile of rubble in the far future. The gravity plates failed, sending the guards tumbling toward the ceiling. Sound became visual, a series of rippling colors that blinded the sensors. Silas felt his stomach lurch into his throat. He saw himself as a child on Earth, running through a field of yellow wheat, while simultaneously feeling the cold floor of the chamber beneath his boots. Focus on the anchor, he screamed in his own mind. He grabbed Calith's arm and pulled her toward the side exit. They moved through a world that was melting. The walls were turning into liquid light. Silas saw Jax trying to intercept them, but the ambassador was caught in a pocket of slow time, his movements dragging like a recording being played at 1/10 speed. Move, move, move! Silas grunted, his muscles straining against the distorted physics. They burst through the doors and into the maintenance quarters. The air here was better, cooler, smelling of grease and recycled water. The distortion was fading as they moved further from the epicenter, but the station's alarms were already screaming, a high-pitched wail that echoed through the levels of Oasis 9. We just started a war, Calith said, her voice shaking as they ran past a startled technician who was staring at a floating wrench. No, Silas said, dodging a cleaning drone that had lost its pathing. We just declined an invitation to a funeral. Yours. They reached the service elevator. Silas punched the code for the docking levels, his fingers slick with sweat. He looked at Calith. Her starlight hair was wild, her midnight skin glowing with a frantic, pulsing energy. Are you okay? He asked. I have never felt so light, she whispered, and so terrified. That's the secret, Princess, Silas said as the elevator jolted into motion. The fear is how you know you're still alive. The trick is not letting it take the wheel. The elevator doors opened to the chaos of the docking bays. Security teams were already beginning to swarm the main gates, their armored suits clanking on the metal floors. Silas didn't head for the main gate. He veered left, toward the secondary fueling conduits. Where are we going? Calith asked, her robes trailing shadow smoke behind her. Bay 42 is too hot, Silas said. They'll have clamped the Star Kicker before we even get close. We need a different way out. He stopped at a heavy blast door marked Automated Freight, Personnel Prohibited. He pulled a dirty-looking data spike from his pocket and jammed it into the control panel. This is illegal, Calith noted, watching the screen flicker with lines of code. Princess, I've been living on the wrong side of the law since I was 18 years old, Silas said, his eyes scanning the progress bar. In the rim, illegal is just another word for efficient. The doors hissed open. Inside was a massive hangar filled with automated cargo pods, unmanned vessels designed to haul ore between the station and the nearby asteroid belts. They were little more than engines with boxes attached. But they were fast, and more importantly, they were invisible to most of the station's high-level security sweeps. "We're taking one of those?" Kalith asked, staring at a rust-streaked pod that looked like a giant metal coffin. "Not taking," Silas corrected, as he climbed up the maintenance ladder of Pod 907. "Borrowing. Permanently." He hauled Kalith up after him. The interior of the pod was cramped, filled with the smell of raw iron and stale coolant. There were no chairs, just a small cockpit designed for a single technician. Silas sat in the seat and pulled Kalith onto his lap. "Hold on to the anchor," he told her, pressing the silver disc into her hand. "This is going to be a bumpy ride." He bypassed the pod's safety protocols with a series of practice strikes on the console. The engine beneath them groaned, a low, guttural thrum that vibrated through Silas's spine. "Warning, cargo clamps engaged," the pod's computer stated in a monotone voice. "Blow the clamps," Silas whispered. He hit a red toggle. A sharp metallic bang echoed through the hangar as the mag locks were sheared off. The pod lurched forward, drifting out of its berth. "Wait," Kalith said, her eyes fixed on the viewport. "Look." Silas looked. Standing at the edge of the docking platform was Jax. The cybernetic envoy wasn't moving. He wasn't calling for reinforcements. He was just watching them. His optical sensor pulsed once, a single steady blue light. "He's letting us go," Kalith whispered. "Or he's tracking us," Silas muttered, his hands dancing over the thruster controls. "Either way, we're out of time." He slammed the throttle forward. The pod's engines screamed as they ignited, the thrust pinning them back against the seat. They shot out of the hangar and into the blackness of space, a tiny speck of metal fleeing the glittering lights of Oasis 9. Behind them, the station looked like a diamond in the dark, beautiful and cold. Ahead of them was nothing but the void. Silas let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since he stood up in the council chamber. He looked at the woman in his arms. She was staring at the stars, her eyes reflecting the infinite distance. "Where to now, Captain?" she asked. Silas looked at the navigation screen. The coordinates from the signal were burned into his mind, a series of numbers that felt less like data and more like a map of his own soul. "We head for the dead zone," he said. "We find the source of the noise." "And what if the noise is a warning?" Kalith asked. "What if they aren't waiting for a friend? What if they're waiting for a target?" Silas looked at the silver disc in her hand. "Then we'll be the fastest moving target they've ever seen," he said. He checked the fuel levels. 3,000 kilometers until the first jump point. 50 hours of life support. 0 credits in the bank. Perfect, Silas thought. Just another Tuesday in the life of a ghost. The cargo pod was not built for comfort, and it certainly wasn't built for a princess whose presence acted like a localized gravitational anomaly. For 36 hours, Silas and Kalith had been drifting through the silent corridors between the stars, the pod's small thrusters occasionally firing to keep them on course for the first jump gate. The interior of the pod was a graveyard of industrial smells and cramped geometry. Silas had spent the last 5 hours trying to recalibrate the life support system, which seemed to think that 20 degrees Celsius was an optional suggestion rather than a requirement for human survival. "You're redlining the oxygen scrubbers again," Silas muttered, his voice echoing in the small space. He was hunched over a panel of wires, his fingers covered in a thin layer of black grease. "I am not doing anything," Kalith replied from the corner. She was wrapped in a thermal blanket, her starlight hair dimmed to a soft, flickering silver. "The singularity responds to my state of mind. If I am cold, the air becomes thin. If I am anxious, the gravity fluctuates." "Well, try thinking about a beach on Kepler 4, Silas said, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Or a nice warm engine room. Anything that doesn't involve us freezing to death before we hit the rift." Kalith didn't answer. She was staring at the silver disc of the Cortex anchor, turning it over in her midnight fingers. The vibration of the disc was the only constant in their small, chaotic world. "Why did you do it, Silas?" she asked quietly. Silas stopped working on the wires. "Do what? Escape? I already told you, the council was going to turn you into a science project. I don't like scientists. They ask too many questions, and they never pay for the coffee." "No," she said, her void black eyes finding his. "Why did you stand up in the first place? Back on the station. You didn't know me. You knew the rumors. You knew that every man who came before you had his mind turned into a pile of ash. You had a ship, a job, a life. Why throw it all away for a stranger? Silas sat back on his heels looking at her. He thought about the empty bunk on the Star Kicker. He thought about the 10 years of silent freight runs, the nameless bars on nameless moons, the feeling of being a ghost that everyone could see but no one could hear. I didn't have a life, Caleth, he said, his voice dropping an octave. I had a routine. There's a difference. People think that as long as you're breathing and your heart is beating, you're alive. But I've spent 20 years just existing. I was waiting for something to happen, something that wasn't a bill or an engine failure. He looked at his hands, scarred and calloused from decades of hard labor. When I saw you standing there, surrounded by all those powerful people who were terrified of you, I didn't see a weapon. I saw a girl who was as lonely as I was. And I figured, if the universe is going to be this big and this empty, maybe we don't have to be small and alone in it together. Caleth watched him, her expression a mix of wonder and something that looked like grief. You think you are a ghost, Silas Vane. But ghosts don't bleed. Ghosts don't risk their souls for a dream they barely understand. I'm a stubborn ghost then, Silas said, turning back to the wires. The pod's proximity alarm began to chirp, a low rhythmic sound that meant they were approaching the jump gate. Finally, Silas said, standing up and moving to the cockpit. The gate was a massive ring of pulsating blue energy floating in the darkness, a gateway through the folding of space. It was the only way into the dead zone, a sector of the galaxy that had been abandoned by the core systems after the Great Collapse. We're coming up on the gate, he said, his hands moving over the controls. This is where it gets tricky. The gate is automated, but it's old. It doesn't like unexpected cargo. We need to spoof the pod's ID code so it thinks we're a standard ore shipment. I can help, Caleth said, moving to stand behind him. How? Silas asked, not looking back. Unless you've got a secret degree in quantum encryption, I don't see how. I can't code, she said, but I can influence the probability. The singularity is a bridge, remember? If I want the gate to think we are a piece of ore, I can make the reality of the sensors flexible. Silas hesitated. The last time she'd let her power go, they'd nearly turned the council chamber into a temporal soup. But they didn't have a choice. The station's security would be tracking the pod's trajectory, and if they didn't make the jump now, they'd be caught in the open. Do it, he said, but keep it tight. I don't want to end up in the middle of a star because you were thinking about a piece of coal. Caleth closed her eyes. She reached out her hand and rested it on the dashboard. The air in the pod didn't warp this time. Instead, it became incredibly still. Silas felt a sensation like 1,000 tiny needles pressing against his skin. The sensors on the console began to flicker, the numbers jumping and changing at impossible speeds. The jump gate responded. The blue energy in the center of the ring shifted to a deep, resonant violet. Identification accepted, the gate's automated voice boomed in the cockpit. Cargo, 5,000 tons of raw iron ore. Destination, Sector 0. 5,000 tons? Silas muttered. I need to go on a diet. He slammed the throttle into the jump position. The world vanished. Crossing a jump gate in a standard freighter was an experience of mild nausea and sudden light. Crossing it in an unshielded cargo pod with a living singularity as your navigator was like being shoved through a keyhole while your body was being rearranged into a sonnet. Silas saw colors that didn't exist in the visible spectrum. He heard the sound of 1,000 voices speaking in a language made of math. He felt his 38 years of life being compressed into a single second, then stretched out until he was older than the stars themselves. Hold on, he tried to yell, but he had no breath. He felt Caleth's hand on his shoulder, a solid point in the chaos. Her presence was like a lighthouse in the middle of a psychic hurricane. She wasn't just influencing the gate, she was guiding them through the fold. Then with a bone-jarring jolt, they were out. The silence that followed was absolute. Silas slumped in the seat, his vision swimming with after-images of purple light. He checked the life support. Still green. He checked the fuel. We're in the red, but we're here. He looked out the viewport. They were in the dead zone. It was unlike any part of space Silas had ever seen. The stars here were dim, shrouded in thick clouds of dark nebula gas. There were no trading stations, No beacon lights, no traffic. It was a graveyard of silence. But in the center of the viewport, glowing with a faint, rhythmic pulse, was a structure. It was massive. It made Oasis 9 look like a children's toy. It was a sphere of dark metal, miles and miles across, covered in patterns that looked like ancient circuitry. It wasn't rotating, it was simply existing, a silent god in the middle of the dark. "The first machine," Caleth whispered, her voice filled with awe. Silas stared at it. He felt the silver disc in his pocket vibrating with an intensity that made his leg go numb. The signal was no longer a ping, it was a roar. "We made it," he said, his voice shaking. But as he looked at the massive structure, he saw something else. On the sensors, a series of small, fast-moving blips were appearing. They were coming from the shadows of the nearby asteroids. They weren't Etherian ships, and they weren't core system scouts. These were sleek, jagged vessels, painted in the colors of the Syndicate's Black Ops division. "Jack," Silas growled. He didn't let us go. He followed the breadcrumbs. The blips were closing fast. There were 6 of them, interceptors equipped with EMP cannons and boarding hooks. They weren't here to talk. They were here to collect the asset. Caleth looked at the screen. "What do? We have no weapons, no shields." Silas looked at the first machine, then at the approaching ships. He thought about the council, the matriarch, and the 10 years he'd spent running from people like this. He thought about the girl beside him, who had finally found the place she belonged, only to have the galaxy try to snatch it away again. He looked at the throttle. He looked at the navigation console. "We don't need weapons," Silas said, his eyes narrowing. "We have the key." He turned to Caleth. "Can you talk to it? The machine?" I don't know," she said, her hands trembling. "It's so big, Silas. I can feel it. It's like a mountain made of thoughts." "Then climb the mountain," Silas said. "Tell it we're home. Tell it the guest has arrived, and she brought a very cranky pilot with her." Caleth looked at the massive sphere. She took a deep breath, and for the first time, she didn't look afraid. She looked like a queen. She closed her eyes and reached out her mind. The pod's engines groaned as Silas pushed them toward the sphere. Behind them, the Syndicate ships opened fire. Bolts of blue energy streaked past the viewport, narrowly missing the hull. "Warning, integrity breach imminent," the computer stated. "Just a little further," Silas whispered, his hands steady on the controls. Suddenly, the first machine responded. A beam of pure white light erupted from the center of the sphere. It didn't hit the pod. It hit the space around it. The light expanded, forming a protective shell that swallowed the pod whole. The Syndicate ships fired again, but their shots dissolved into the light like raindrops hitting a furnace. Silas felt the pod being pulled toward the sphere. They were moving at impossible speeds, but there was no sensation of G-force. It was like they were being carried by a gentle hand. As they approached the surface of the machine, a massive doorway opened, revealing a hangar lit with the same amber glow Silas had seen in the Etherian embassy. They slid inside, the doors closing behind them with a silent finality. The pod came to a gentle stop on a platform of polished stone. Silas sat back, his hands finally dropping from the controls. He looked at Caleth. She was still in the trance, her eyes glowing with a soft, steady light. "We're inside," he said softly. Caleth opened her eyes. She looked around the hangar, her expression one of profound peace. "It's beautiful, Silas," she said. Silas looked around. It was beautiful. It was also terrifyingly advanced. But as he stood up and helped Caleth out of the pod, he realized that he wasn't thinking about the technology. He wasn't thinking about the power or the signal. He was thinking about the fact that they were safe. For now. They stepped onto the stone floor. As they walked toward the center of the hall, a holographic figure appeared in front of them. It wasn't a monster or a god. It was a woman, ancient and wise, with skin the color of a nebula, and eyes that held the secrets of 1,000 worlds. "Welcome, Caleth of the 7th bloodline," the figure said, its voice echoing in the chambers of the machine. "We have been waiting for you." "And who is this?" the figure asked, turning its gaze to Silas. "He's my consort," Caleth said, her voice firm. "He's the one who brought me home." The figure looked at Silas for a long moment. A human? A species of fragile minds and short lives. "Why did you help her?" Silas Vane. Silas looked at the ancient hologram, then at the girl beside him. Because I was tired of being a ghost, he said, and because she asked. The figure smiled. Courage is not the absence of fear, Captain Vane. It is the realization that something else is more important than fear. Silas nodded. Yeah, I'm starting to figure that out. As they walked deeper into the heart of the first machine, Silas knew that the war wasn't over. The core systems would be coming. The syndicate would be coming. The entire galaxy would be banging on the door soon enough. But as he felt Calith's hand in his, he knew that they were ready. The ghosts of the Rim had finally found a place to haunt, and they weren't going anywhere. The heart of the first machine did not look like the engine room of a starship. There were no clanking pistons, no hissing steam, and none of the comforting, greasy smells that Silas had associated with machinery for 38 years. Instead, the deeper they walked into the sphere, the more the environment resembled a vast, silent cathedral of amber light. The walls were semi-translucent, revealing millions of tiny, gold-threaded conduits that pulsed with the steady rhythm of a sleeping god. Every step Silas took felt like he was treading on the skin of something alive. The cortex anchor in his pocket was vibrating so violently now that it felt like a trapped insect, a frantic hum that resonated through his thigh and up into his chest. He could feel the signal. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a physical weight, a symphony of data that translated into colors and scents he didn't have names for. The holographic figure, the one who called herself the archivist, glided ahead of them. She didn't walk. She simply existed in one place and then another, her form flickering with the soft glow of a dying nebula. You are quiet, Captain Vane, the archivist said, her voice echoing in Silas's mind like the chime of a silver bell. For a man who has spent his life navigating the loud voids of the frontier, this place must seem unsettling. Unsettling is a polite way of putting it, Silas grunted. He adjusted the collar of his flight jacket, which felt suddenly restrictive in the humid, charged air of the core. Usually, when I'm this deep in a reactor, I can hear if a bearing is about to go, or if the coolant is running thin. Here it's just static, like the whole place is waiting for a punchline. It is waiting for a command, Calith said softly. She was walking with a strange grace, her midnight skin absorbing the amber light until she seemed to glow from within. The starlight hair that had been wild and frantic during their escape was now flowing behind her in a calm, orderly stream. I can feel the machine, Silas. It isn't just a computer, it's a memory. It remembers the first ones. It remembers the day the Etherians were born. They reached a central chamber that defied all known laws of architecture. It was a sphere within a sphere, 1,000 meters wide, with a single bridge of solid light stretching across the center to a floating pedestal. Below the bridge there was no floor, only a swirling vortex of purple and gold energy that looked like a captured sun. The ether core, the archivist announced. This is the source of the signal you heard on the station, and it is the cure for the distortion that plagues your bloodline, Princess. Calith stopped at the edge of the light bridge. A cure? You mean I can be normal? I can exist without breaking the world around me? Normal is a subjective term, the archivist replied, her form shimmering. The internal singularity you carry is not a defect. It is a fragmented piece of the first machine's operating system. When your ancestors left this place, they took the keys with them, but they forgot how to turn the locks. Over 2,000 years, the keys became heavy. They began to warp the hands that held them. Silas looked at the swirling vortex below. So, what's the plan? You just plug her in and download a firmware update? The archivist turned her nebula eyes toward Silas. It is not that simple, human. To stabilize the singularity, the energy must be grounded. It requires a biological anchor, a consciousness that can exist between the frequencies of the machine and the frequencies of the material world. The Etherians have become too attuned to the void. They lack the grit of the physical. Silas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Grit. You're looking for someone with a thick skull and a lack of imagination. The archivist nodded. Your brain, Captain Vane, has been scarred by 20 years of jump space transitions. You have developed a temporal scar tissue that makes you uniquely resistant to the fragmentation. You are already half unmade. You are the only bridge we have. Silas took a step back, his boots scuffing the amber floor. Hold on. You're talking about a permanent connection. You're talking about me becoming part of the plumbing. It would not be a death, the archivist said, but it would be a transformation. Your human identity, your memories of Earth, your sense of linear time, they would be subsumed by the consciousness of the machine. You would be the anchor that allows Kaleth to walk among her people without destroying them. You would be the silence that allows her to speak. Silas looked at Kaleth. She was staring at him, her eyes wide with a sudden sharp horror. No, she said, her voice cracking. No, Silas. I didn't bring you here for this. I didn't ask for a sacrifice. I asked for a partner. Silas rubbed his face with his hand, feeling the stubble on his chin. He thought about his life. 38 years of hauling isotopes, dodging creditors and drinking cheap synth ale in backwater ports. He thought about the Star Kicker, currently being stripped for parts in a syndicate bay. He thought about the empty rooms he had lived in and the empty future that had been waiting for him. He was a ghost. He had been a ghost for a long time. But this wasn't just fading away. This was being erased. I'm terrified, Silas admitted, his voice barely a whisper. For the first time since they had met, he didn't try to hide it. He didn't use a joke or a snarky comment to deflect the fear. He let it show in the slump of his shoulders and the tremor in his hands. I've spent my whole life bugging out when things got too heavy, he said, looking at Kaleth. I'm a runner. That's what pilots do. We find the exit and we burn leather until the sensors are clear. Kaleth walked over to him, reaching out but stopping just short of touching him. The purple haze around her was frantic, the shadows on the walls dancing in jagged, broken patterns. Then don't stop now, she said. We can find another way. We can leave this place. We can hide in the rim. And then what? Silas asked. You spend another 17 years in a room while the core systems hunt you down? You wait for the next suitor whose head isn't as thick as mine? He looked at the light bridge. He thought about the humanistic theme he had been running from his whole life. He had always believed that being brave meant being the guy who didn't feel the fear, the guy in the hollows who walked into the fire with a grin. But standing there at the edge of forever, he realized that the heroes in the hollows were full of it. Real courage wasn't a lack of fear. It was being so scared you wanted to vomit, and then choosing the thing that mattered more than your own skin. If I do this, Silas said to the archivist, what happens to her? She becomes the guardian of the signal, the archivist replied. She will have the power to protect this sector from those who would use the first machine as a weapon. She will be whole. Silas took a breath, the air tasting like ancient dust and lightning. I need 5 minutes, he said. The archivist bowed her head and vanished into the amber light. Silas and Kaleth stood alone in the center of the world. The roar of the ether core was a constant, low thrum beneath their feet. You don't have to do this, Silas, Kaleth said. I'll find another way. I'll go back to the station. I'll surrender. Like hell you will, Silas said. He reached out and, for the first time, he didn't wait for her to offer her hand. He took it. The shock was there, the usual explosion of sensory chaos, but he pushed through it. He looked her right in those twin void eyes. Listen to me, princess. My life was a washout before I stood up in that hall. I was zeroed out. No family, no home, no purpose. Just a lot of miles and a lot of regrets. He squeezed her hand, ignoring the way his own skin seemed to be turning translucent. Meeting you? It was the first time I felt like I wasn't just cargo. It was the first time I felt like I was the pilot again. He managed a weak, lopsided smile. If I become the anchor, I'm not dying. I'm just taking the ultimate long-haul contract, and I'm doing it because you're worth the price of the ticket. Silas, don't go all mushy on me now, he said, his voice thick. I've got a reputation as a gritty grease monkey to maintain. Suddenly, the floor of the chamber shuddered. A deep, resonant boom echoed through the machine, followed by a sound that Silas recognized all too well. The high-pitched whine of a focused energy beam hitting a hull. The Syndicate, Silas growled. They found a way through the light shell. A holographic window flickered into existence. It showed the exterior of the first machine. A massive fleet of syndicate ships, led by a colossal dreadnought, was positioned around the sphere. At the front of the dreadnought was a weapon Silas had only heard of in Scuttlebutt, a void cracker. It was designed to punch holes in the fabric of space itself. "Jax," Silas whispered, seeing the ambassador's face on a secondary transmission feed. He wasn't tracking them to find the machine. He was tracking them to find the door. "Silas," the matriarch's voice broke through the comms, sounding distorted and cold. "Surrender the human and the princess. The core systems will not allow the first machine to be controlled by a rogue element. If you do not open the hangar, we will crack the sphere and take what remains." The archivist reappeared, her form flickering with alarm. "The sphere's integrity is at 60%. The void cracker is destabilizing the ether core. If they fire again, the resulting explosion will erase this entire star system." Silas looked at Caleth. There was no more time for 5 minutes. No more time for goodbyes. "Go to the pedestal," he said, his voice flat and certain. "No! Caleth, do it!" Silas roared, his military training taking over. "If you don't stabilize the core now, everyone on this station, every life in this sector, is KIA. You want that on your head?" He grabbed her shoulders, ignoring the purple sparks that were now leaping from her skin to his jacket. "I'm a pilot," he said, his voice softening. "And right now the engines are failing, and the hull is screaming. This is the only way to save the ship. You are the ship, Caleth. Now get to the bridge." Caleth looked at him, her tears falling as starlight onto his boots. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his. "I will find you, Silas Vane," she whispered. "In the code, in the light, in the memories of this place. I will never let you be a ghost again." She turned and ran across the bridge of light toward the pedestal. Silas watched her go, his heart breaking in a way that had nothing to do with physics. He turned to the archivist. "All right, you ancient gearhead. How do we do this?" "Step into the center of the vortex," the archivist said. "Do not fight the fragmentation. Become it." Silas walked to the edge of the light bridge. He looked down into the swirling sun of the ether core. He felt the fear. It was a cold, sharp blade in his gut. He was 38 years old, and he was about to give up everything he was for a girl he had known for less than a week. He thought about the lesson his father had taught him. Courage isn't the absence of fear. He took the silver disc of the Cortex anchor from his pocket and looked at it one last time. Then he tossed it into the void. "I'm Silas Vane," he whispered to the empty air. "And I don't run." He stepped off the bridge. The sensation of falling into the ether core was not one of speed, but of dissolution. Silas didn't hit the energy. He became part of it. He felt his physical body, the scars on his knuckles, the ache in his back, the smell of engine oil that had stained his pores, being pulled apart molecule by molecule. It wasn't painful, but it was profoundly wrong. It was like being unwritten, one word at a time. He saw his life flash before him, but not as a movie. It was a spatial map. He saw the day he left Earth at age 18, the coordinates of his first solo flight, the 3,000 credits he had lost in a card game on Nixara Station. He saw the face of every person he had ever disappointed. Then he felt a hand. It wasn't a physical hand. It was a presence, a firm, stubborn tether in the middle of the whirlwind. Silas, it was Caleth. She had reached the pedestal. She had tapped into the machine's consciousness, and she was reaching down into the core to find him. "I'm here," he tried to say, but he had no voice. He was a stream of data now, a sequence of ones and zeros fighting to maintain the shape of a man. "Don't let go," she screamed in the silence of his mind. "I'm trying," Silas thought, "but I'm losing the signal. I can't remember the color of the sky." Suddenly, the void cracker hit the exterior of the sphere again. The shock wave ripped through the machine, causing the ether core to spike with a violent, unstable energy. Silas felt himself being pushed away from Caleth, drifting toward the dark edges of the consciousness where nothing existed but the void. On the sensors of the Syndicate Dreadnought, the readings were going off the charts. Ambassador Jax stood on the bridge, his optical sensors whirring. "The energy levels are peaking, Matriarch. The human has entered the core. The stabilization process has begun." "Good," the Matriarch said. her voice echoing through the bridge of the ship. "Once the core is stable, we move in. The princess will be our ward again, and the first machine will be the new capital of the Etherean hegemony." "But what about the human?" Jax asked. "The human is a necessary component," the matriarch replied coldly. "He is the anchor. He will remain in the core. He is a part of the machine now. He is no longer a concern." Jax looked at the screen, a flicker of something resembling regret passing through his cybernetic processors. He had known many pilots in his 200 years of service. He had seen many men die for gold, for glory, or for duty, but he had never seen a man step into a furnace for a person he barely knew. "He's not a component," Jax muttered, his voice too low for the matriarch to hear. "He's a damn fool." Inside the core, Silas was losing the battle. The fear was winning. The void was so much bigger than he was. It was so much easier to just let go, to stop being Silas Vane, and just be part of the light. Then he felt the vibration. It was faint but unmistakable. The frequency of Earth's magnetic field. The cortex anchor. He hadn't tossed it away. The machine had incorporated it. The silver disc was floating in the core with him, a tiny vibrating piece of metal that was refusing to be unmade. It was a piece of home. It was a piece of him. Silas focused on the vibration. He used it as a compass, a way to find north in a world with no directions. "I am Silas Vane," he thought, the words echoing through the golden threads of the machine. "I am a pilot. I am 38 years old. I have 2,000 credits in a hidden account on Kepler-4. I like my coffee black and my engines hot." He felt his consciousness begin to solidify. He reached out with his mind, grabbing the threads of the ether core and pulling them toward him. He wasn't fighting the machine anymore. He was piloting it. "Kalith, I've got the lead," he signaled. She felt him. The pedestal in the center of the chamber began to glow with a blinding white light. The purple distortion that had surrounded Kalith for 17 years suddenly pulled inward, focusing into a single brilliant point of energy on her forehead, the mark of the Guardian. The internal singularity was no longer a storm. It was a lens. Kalith opened her eyes, and they were no longer voids. They were filled with the light of 1,000 stable suns. She reached out her hand toward the holographic view of the Syndicate fleet. "Leave this place," she said, her voice carrying the authority of the First Ones. The matriarch sneered. "You are a child, Kalith. You do not command the core systems." Kalith didn't argue. She simply adjusted the lens. A pulse of energy erupted from the first machine. It wasn't a weapon. It was a physical rejection. The Syndicate ships were pushed backward, their engines stalling, their systems rebooting. It was as if the universe had decided they no longer belonged in that particular sector of space. The dreadnought groaned as its void cracker shattered under the pressure of the repulsion. "Retreat!" Jax yelled, his sensors screaming. "We cannot hold the position. The machine has awakened." The Syndicate fleet turned and fled, burning their engines to escape the gravity well of the dead zone. Inside the core, the stabilization was complete. Silas felt the energy settle into a steady, rhythmic hum. He was still part of the machine, but he wasn't erased. He was the interface. He was the one who translated the vast, ancient data of the First Ones into a language Kalith could understand. He could see everything. He saw the traffic on Oasis 9, the birth of a star in a distant nebula, and the way the dust settled on the floor of the Sovereign Suite. He also saw Kalith. She was standing on the bridge of light, looking down into the core. She looked whole. She looked beautiful. "Silas," she whispered. "I'm here, Princess," he replied. His voice was a blend of his own gravelly tone and the harmonic chime of the machine. "I'm just a little spread out at the moment." She knelt on the bridge, pressing her hand against the light. "We did it. The signal is stable. The machine is ours." "Yeah," Silas said, "but I think I'm going to need a really long nap after this." "You're not going to disappear?" "No," he said, and he realized it was true. The fear had tried to tell him he would be lost, but by facing it, he had found a way to survive. "I'm the anchor, remember? I'm not going anywhere." The transformation was painful. Every time he moved his mind, it felt like pulling a muscle he didn't know he had. He could feel the weight of the machine's ancient memories pressing against his human ego, trying to smooth out the rough edges of his personality. But Silas Vane was nothing if not rough edges. He held on to his memories of the Star Kicker. He held on to the smell of synthale and the sound of a bad engine. He used his flaws as a shield against the perfection of the machine. He was the ghost in the machine, and he was perfectly happy with that. Kalith stayed by the core for hours, talking to him, telling him about the things she was seeing through her new lens. She told him about the worlds they would visit, the people they would help, and the way the galaxy looked when you weren't afraid of it. Silas listened. He was the silence that allowed her to speak, but he was also the man who had stood up in the hall. As the first day of their new life began, Silas realized that the archivist had been right about one thing. He had been unmade, but he had also been rebuilt. He was no longer a freighter pilot running from his debts. He was the man who had looked into the void and told it to back off. And as he felt Kalith's presence anchoring him to the world, he knew that the price he had paid was a bargain. He had lost his life, but he had found his soul. And for Silas Vane, that was more than enough. The first machine was silent once more, but it was a living silence. The amber light pulsed with a slow, steady heartbeat. Kalith stood at the main viewport of the core, watching the Syndicate fleet vanish into the distance. She felt the power of the machine flowing through her, but she didn't feel the weight of it. She felt the anchor. She felt Silas. He was there, in the walls, in the light, in the very air she breathed. He was the one who made it possible for her to be a person instead of a weapon. She touched the mark on her forehead. "Thank you, Silas," she whispered. The air in the room shimmered, and for a split second, the ghost of a man in a worn flight jacket appeared beside her. He didn't speak, but he gave her a small, crooked smile and a wink before fading back into the light. Kalith smiled back. The galaxy was still a dangerous, complicated place. There were still wars to be fought, debts to be paid, and slick shifters to be outsmarted. But they had a map now. And they had a pilot. The journey was just beginning. The immediate aftermath of the awakening was a silence so profound it felt heavy. In the heart of the first machine, the amber glow had settled into a steady, rhythmic pulse, the heartbeat of a god that had finally found its pace. For Kalith, the world had changed from a fractured mirror into a clear, sharp lens. For Silas Vane, the world had simply expanded. He was no longer contained within the limits of 5 liters of blood and 160 pounds of bone and scar tissue. He was threaded through the ancient circuitry of the sphere, his consciousness flowing through gold-veined conduits and amber light streams. He could feel the cold vacuum of space pressing against the machine's outer hull, and simultaneously he could feel the warmth of Kalith's hand as she rested it against the central pedestal. "Silas," her voice echoed, not in his ears, but in the very core of his awareness. It was a soft, shimmering sound, stripped of the static that had plagued her for 17 years. "Still here, princess," Silas replied. His voice was a strange thing now, a composite of his old gravelly baritone and the harmonic chimes of the machine. "Just trying to figure out how to scratch an itch on my left elbow when my left elbow is currently 3 kilometers of reinforced hull plating." A ghost of a laugh escaped her lips. She looked toward the holographic projection where Silas's image flickered, a translucent version of the man in the worn flight jacket, leaning against an invisible bulkhead with a crooked grin. He looked more real than he had on Oasis 9, less like a man running from a debt and more like a man who had finally found the right ship to pilot. Beyond the sphere, the galaxy was in a state of absolute high-alert chaos. The Syndicate fleet had jumped to the nearest relay station, their sensors fried and their pride even more damaged. But the core systems were not so easily deterred. In the silence that followed the repulsion, a dozen different channels were screaming for attention. "They won't stop, will they?" Kalith asked, looking at the tactical display flickering in the air. "The Council, the Matriarch. They see a miracle and all they can think about is how to put a leash on it." "That's the nature of the beast," Silas said, his spectral eyes narrowing as he scanned the data streams. "To a guy with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. To a politician with a war chest, every new power looks like a weapon. They're scared, Kalith, and scared people do stupid things." "And what about us?" she asked, her gaze turning inward. I can feel the signal now. It's not just a ping anymore. It's a network. This machine, it's a sanctuary, Silas. It was built to protect the fragile ones, the ones who didn't fit the mold, like us. Silas processed this. In his current state, he could see the history of the first ones, not in dates or names, but in the emotional resonance they had left behind. They were a race of builders who had reached the end of their own journey and decided to leave a lighthouse for the children they would never meet. We're the lighthouse keepers, Silas said. The realization hit him with a weight that would have buckled his human knees. That's the contract. No more hauling isotopes for the syndicate. No more dodging pirates in the outer rim. We stay here, we hold the line, and we make sure no one turns this place into a fortress. The conflict resolution began not with a battle, but with a broadcast. Through the massive transmitters of the first machine, Silas and Kayla sent a message that bypassed every encryption and every firewall in the core systems. It appeared on the view screens of battle cruisers, the personal pads of merchants, in the grand displays of Eterna. It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. This is the Dead Zone Sanctuary, Kayla's voice rang out across 40 star systems. The first machine has awakened, not as a weapon of war, but as a bridge for the lost. To the governments of the core, stay beyond the 3 light-year perimeter, and you will be left in peace. Attempt to enter with hostile intent, and the void will simply return you to your origin. To the individuals who have nowhere left to go, the signal is your map. Follow it. In the back of the broadcast, there was a secondary signal, a low-frequency hum that carried the signature of Silas Vane. It was a message to every debt collector, every pirate, and every lonely pilot in the galaxy. It said, "The ghost has found a home, and he's watching the door." Ambassador Jax, currently being interrogated by the Council for his failure to secure the asset, watched the broadcast from a holding cell. His red optical sensor pulsed a steady, calm blue. He knew the Council would try to spin this as a threat to security, but he also knew the truth. He had seen Silas Vane step into the fire. "He's a washout," Jax whispered to the empty room, his mechanical voice carrying a trace of mechanical pride. "A total, beautiful washout. Good luck, Captain. Try not to break the universe too much." Back in the core, the immediate adrenaline of the escape was fading, replaced by the long-term reality of their choice. Silas felt the machine beginning to integrate his memories into its defensive protocols. He saw the yellow wheat fields of Earth being used to calibrate the life support filters. He saw the layout of his old cockpit being used to design the interface for the sanctuary's upcoming guests. He was processing the lesson in real time. He had spent 38 years believing that freedom meant having no anchors. He had thought that being a ghost was the only way to avoid being hurt. But as he watched Kayla move through the amber halls, her face illuminated by a peace she had never known, he understood that he had it backward. An anchor doesn't just hold you back, it keeps you from drifting into the abyss. "It's going to be a long 6 months, Silas said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "The Covenant said we have to decide by then, permanently." Kayla stopped and looked at the translucent man. She smiled, and the starlight in her hair seemed to pulse in time with the machine's core. "I think I've already decided, Silas. What about you?" "I'm a pilot who's found the perfect ship and a girl who likes my bad jokes," Silas said. "I'd be a fool to bug out now." But as he spoke, he felt the first true cost of the transformation. He reached out to touch her cheek, and his hand passed right through her, leaving only a faint shimmer of purple light. He couldn't feel the warmth of her skin. He couldn't smell the ozone of her presence. He was a part of everything, but he was physically part of nothing. The pain of that realization was sharp, but it didn't break him. He took a metaphorical breath, flexed the muscles of the machine's gravity sensors, and stood his ground. He had made his choice. He had stepped into the fire, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the heat. 10,000 hours had passed since the day the first machine woke up. Time in the dead zone didn't move in seconds and minutes anymore. It moved in the rhythmic cycles of the ether core and the slow, steady arrivals of the found. Oasis 9 was a distant memory, a glittering cage of bureaucracy that Silas Vane no longer recognized. The sanctuary had grown. The first machine wasn't just a sphere of dark metal anymore. It had blossomed into a hub of life. Small ships, mostly rust buckets and converted freighters like the Star Kicker, were docked in the massive hangars. These were the ships of the unwanted, refugees from the Syndicate Wars, scholars who had been silenced by the Council, and pilots who were tired of hauling death for a living. They called themselves the Echoes, and at the heart of their world was the Guardian and the Anchor. Kaleth moved through the hangar, her midnight skin no longer a source of terror for those around her. She was wearing a simple flight suit now, her silver hair tied back. The mark on her forehead pulsed with a soft, steady glow, a beacon of stability for the entire station. She was helping a young Terran girl fix a faulty cooling unit on a civilian shuttle. "You have to listen to the hum," Kaleth said, her voice warm and clear. "If it sounds like a growl, the bearings are dry. If it sounds like a whistle, you've got a leak." The girl looked up at the princess with wide, admiring eyes. "How do you know that?" "A very stubborn man taught me," Kaleth said, glancing up at the ceiling. High above them, in the structural lattice of the hangar, a faint shimmer of purple light appeared. Silas Vane's spectral form was sitting on a crossbeam, his legs dangling over a 100-meter drop that he could no longer fall through. He was watching them with a look of quiet satisfaction. He was different now. The rough edges of the freighter pilot had been tempered by the vast, ancient wisdom of the machine. But the core of the man remained. He still wore the translucent version of his flight jacket. He still had that lopsided, cynical grin. But the fear that had once lived in the corners of his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, immovable purpose. The transformation was evident in every action he took. He wasn't just maintaining the systems, he was nurturing the community. When a new ship arrived, Silas would adjust the docking tractor beams so gently they wouldn't rattle a cup of coffee. When the atmosphere in the residential levels felt a bit stale, he would breathe a fresh scent of earth clover through the vents. He was the invisible hand that made the impossible life in the dead zone feel ordinary. He had learned that courage wasn't a grand, one-time gesture. It was a daily choice. It was the choice to stay when the void called you to drift. It was the choice to care when it was easier to be indifferent. Later that evening, in the quiet of the Sovereign Suite, which had been redesigned to feel more like a pilot's lounge and less like a throne room, Silas and Kaleth were alone. She was sitting by the viewport, a real cup of coffee in her hand. Silas was sitting in the chair opposite her, his form shimmering in the amber twilight. "The matriarch sent another message today," Kaleth said, taking a sip of the bitter brew. "She wants to open a formal trade route. She says she's forgiven our departure." "Forgiveness is a funny word for a woman who tried to crack our hull with a void cracker," Silas said, his voice echoing softly. "Tell her the trade routes are open to anyone who leaves their weapons at the door. And tell her if she wants to talk to the Guardian, she has to talk to the Anchor first." Kaleth laughed. "She hates it when I say that. She still thinks of you as a component." "Let her think it," Silas said. "I've been called worse. I've been called a washout, a ghost, and a deadbeat. Being a component of a miracle is a step up in the world." He looked out the viewport at the stars. They were still distant, still silent, but they didn't feel cold anymore. They felt like a neighborhood. "I was thinking about that first day," Silas said, his voice turning contemplative. "In the hall of Oasis 9. I stood up because I had nothing to lose. I thought I was being brave, but I was just being desperate. I didn't care if I lived or died, so I figured I might as well die doing something loud." He paused, his spectral hand reaching out toward the glass. "I realize now that wasn't courage. That was just a high-stakes exit strategy. Real courage. Real courage was the next day. And the day after that, it was when I realized I did have something to lose. I had you. I had this place. I had the people on those ships down in the hangar." He looked at Kaleth, his eyes glowing with a soft amber light. "It's a lot harder to stay when you finally have a reason to be afraid of the end. But that's the trick, isn't it? You don't do it because you're not scared. You do it because the person standing next to you is more important than the fear. You do it because the connection is worth the risk of being unmade." I spent 38 years thinking the galaxy was just a giant, empty engine room where I was the only part that didn't fit. I moved from one star system to another like a ghost through a wall, never leaving a mark, never taking a stand. I told myself that being unattached made me free, but it just made me hollow. I was a man who knew the price of every isotope but the value of nothing. When I took Calith's hand, I thought I was stepping into the void to save her. I didn't realize that she was the one pulling me back into the light, becoming this anchor, this voice in the walls. It wasn't a sacrifice. It was an upgrade. I've lost the ability to feel the cold or taste a burger, sure, but for the first time in my life, I can feel the weight of a promise. I can feel the warmth of being needed. I've learned that humanity isn't something you're born with. It's something you choose to keep when the universe tries to take it away. It's the stubborn refusal to be silent in the dark. It's the decision to be a bridge instead of a wall. I used to be a guy who just wanted to survive the jump. Now I'm the one making sure the jump is worth taking. And honestly, I wouldn't trade this worn-out, spectral jacket for all the credits in the core. Calith set her coffee down and walked over to him. She couldn't touch him, not in the way she used to, but she stood so close that their energies mingled, a soft purple and amber glow that lit up the room. I wonder, Silas said, his voice a gentle hum in the air. I spent my whole life waiting for a sign, for a reason to stop running. I almost missed it because I was too busy looking for a way out. I think about all those people back in the core, still running their freight, still sitting in their grand halls, terrified of the shadows. I wonder how many of them are just waiting for someone to ask the right question. He looked toward the viewer as if he could see through the stars, through the screen, and into the very souls of those watching his story. I spent my life thinking that fear was a wall I had to outrun, only to find out it was a door I had to walk through. I was terrified of being unmade, but in the end, I had to let go of the man I was to become the person I needed to be. I look at you and I wonder, what is that one thing you're so afraid of losing that you've forgotten how to live? What would happen if you stopped running from the storm and started looking for the signal inside it? Would you have the courage to stand up, even if you were the only human in the room? Silas Vane gave a final, crooked wink, his image flickering like a star at the edge of the morning. He turned back to Calith and reached out his hand. He couldn't feel her skin, but he could feel her soul. It was a steady, luminous frequency that matched his own. Outside, the first machine pulsed once, a golden beacon in the velvet dark of the dead zone. A new ship was approaching the perimeter, its engines coughing and its lights flickering. Silas flexed the sensors of the station, cleared the path, and began the delicate work of bringing another one home. The ghost was at the helm, and the light was on.